Hey folks, Noah the farmer here, and welcome to another video. Right now, I'm standing in a patch of our woods that we've had our first batch of pigs on the farm running through over the course of the last 8 weeks. And after this spring of putting in this original test paddock and running the pigs through to observe the impact that they would have, we're excited to build out more permanent fencing out here in the woods, designed around ease of movement from paddock to paddock so that we can easily rotate the pigs through the woods and time their impact in a way that maximizes their intake of grubs and roots while managing for succession. And just to be sure, succession refers to the changes in an ecosystem over time. And this can be impacted by many things, but the general idea is that no ecosystem is static. If you leave a pasture and stop grazing it or mowing it, in our climate, it's always going to want to grow up into woods. What we can do with our human impact and our understanding of ecological patterns is utilize different tools to steer ecological succession in the direction that we want. And that's dependent on our goals. Do we want to see a thriving ecosystem with maximum biodiversity? Do we want to be managing for timber harvest or other kinds of harvests? Do we want to be managing to convert this into more of a silvopasture where there are canopy trees, but there's enough light coming down to encourage the growth of pasture grasses for forage for livestock? In our case, it's really all of the above. We would love to maximize biodiversity and get different tree species in here and minimize the amount of invasive species that are coming in. We would love to get harvests off of this woods, whether that's wild edible harvests from the trees or from shrubs and vines. And we would love to integrate this currently somewhat marginal space on the farm into a more integral part of the farm where we can run different types of animals through because there's adequate forage and the shade benefits them in the summertime here in our southern climate where we get really hot summers and livestock can sometimes suffer. So why don't I show you around and just talk about what we see around here in this part of the woods. So you can see right here, I'm standing on the fence line where the pigs have been versus where they haven't been this spring. And their impact has been tremendous. Pretty much all of the woods, besides the paddock, have grown up really thick with a lot of different plants. And you know, you might look at this and think that looks like a pretty typical forest floor. Is there anything wrong with that? Why are we managing for this? And what we see in here is a large number of invasive species. Southern Appalachia is one of the most biodiverse regions in North America. And really, that extends, it seems, into the invasive species that seem to thrive here as well. There's loads of different invasive plants, and they can really, if left unchecked, take over unmanaged woodlands like this and outcompete the natives. In a place where invasive plants have taken over and outcompeted natives, it becomes a very ecologically sterile environment. And a big part of the reason these plants are invasive is because they don't have any pests or diseases that keep them in check. You know, they evolved in often different places around Asia, and they're not invasive in those parts of the world because there are different herbivores and pests and diseases that help keep the populations at bay, just like we see in a lot of our native species around here. For example, red maple, which does have somewhat of an aggressive growth habit in southern Appalachia, isn't considered an invasive, but in other parts of the world where there's no biological and ecological checks and balances on their growth, they're one of the worst invasive species. So while the pigs have left this a bit bare, we're okay with that. They're curious about my presence. We're okay with that for the short term because what they've been doing is going through and pulling out almost all of the privet. Most of these dead plants on the ground are privets and honeysuckle and multiflora rose and other pretty pernicious invasives that really dominated this whole paddock just laying here. And now there are conditions for native plant seeds to germinate. So we believe that this type of disturbance and this management isn't enough to help steer ecological succession in the direction that we want to see it. we're gonna pair the pigs' disturbance with selectively thinning out some of the trees. One of the dominant species in all of southern Appalachia, and really commonly in these riparian woodlands, is the tulip poplar. If you live anywhere in the east and southeast United States, you'll be familiar with that leaf most likely. And what we see in here is almost all of the poplars and the other hardwoods like cherry and red maple all have multiple sprouts like this. Now, you might remember if you watched the last video about coppicing and how that practice can be done intentionally on certain species like black locust and willow. My theory is that at some point this was unintentionally done in an attempt to clear out these woods, but it was done at a time of year where it encouraged the root sprouts. And we look around and we see just about every canopy mature hardwood in here has multiple stems. What this means for us is that we can harvest out and select some of the stems to come out from each tree that has multiple sprouts like this and get a yield. We can utilize poplar wood for inoculating with oyster mushrooms. It's very good for that. It can be used as a building material. We use a lot of mulch and wood chips around the farm, so we can produce a lot of our own wood chips with some of this wood. And because there's multiple stems on all these trees, we can select the biggest, straightest, most robust to leave and harvest out the other stems that are coming up, allowing us to get a yield while keeping a living tree. And that's going to be of benefit because by selecting out the stems we want to take, it's going to open up a lot of sunlight and canopy penetration, because one of our goals is to convert this from strictly a heavily shaded woodland into a mixed silvopasture with dappled sunlight and enough of that so that different cool season pasture grasses can proliferate in here. This is the stretch of woods that seems to just be an abandoned pine planting. There's a lot of that here in the foothills of western North Carolina for commercial timber production. And you see a lot of plantings that people got gung-ho and planted out some timber, and perhaps property changed hands or goals changed, and you see a lot of tracts of forestry that were planted to pine that don't appear to be actively managed. So it's a very different forest floor in here than where I was just standing, even though I'm only about 500 feet from where the pig paddock is. And in this thick pine duff and pine straw, there's almost a mulching effect like you'd see in a garden where it's snuffing out a lot of understory plants, and we're not seeing a lot of regeneration of any new plants coming up under the thick canopy and the thick pine straw that we have here in these woods. So the plan in this strip is to set up, like I was saying, these more permanent pig paddocks where we can rotate them through, and they can disturb the ground and allow conditions for the germination of native plants. We're going to control for invasives with close monitoring and utilizing the pigs to help remove them. With invasives, you can never really have the goal be eradication, but rather management to acceptable levels. And so that's some of our plans to help steer the succession of these woods over time. Like I've said, to meet our goals as a farm, as well as to promote biodiversity and a thriving woodland environment. Now, it's not all undesirable invasive species coming up in here. Walking through these woods, we see a lot of regeneration of native hardwoods. This is a hickory tree, another one right here. There's loads of dogwoods, red oaks and white oaks, and we can help encourage those trees to thrive and grow into the dominant canopy trees over time, and probably out of the span of our lifetime. But without any kind of intervention or management, it's unlikely that that'll happen in a time scale that will benefit generations soon to come. Many ecosystems across the world are at their most thriving with a pattern of patchy intermittent disturbance events. Wildfires, animal disturbance. There's many examples of different natural events coming through and disrupting the equilibrium of a given ecosystem. And that encourages the proliferation of new life, the complexifying of what types of organisms are there. And many organisms are dependent upon those disturbance events. We see with the increasing base of knowledge around fire ecology, how much wildfire suppression in the United States has really devastated certain species and entire ecosystems across our country. Historically, when you think about the number of animals, and particularly mammals in what is now the United States, that were once ranging through the woodlands and native savannas and prairies, it's hard to really imagine how many creatures that was, but historical accounts, historical ecological accounts, and indigenous knowledge points us to believe that the number of bison on the Western Plains was a number that we can't really even conceive of in modern terms, seeing that amount of animals. And the same is true for elk in woodlands and all kinds of creatures in different ecosystems and habitats. And that has a huge disturbance impact too. The trampling and the defecation and the urination coming through an area and then leaving has a major impact on that ecosystem. And so we're doing our best in managing the farm to learn about those patterns and do our best to mimic some of those patterns with the animals that we're bringing onto the farm. Well, a significant portion of the property is on bottomland, both the pastures and the woods. We also have some woods and some open areas that are up on a ridge, and what we see on the farm is drastically different soil types the second you go from the bottomland to the ridge, and this results in pretty different forest ecosystems. Driving around our county, you see there's so many white oaks that grow really vigorously in McDowell County, and I'm standing in just a section of the woods that the dominant canopy tree is the white oak, which white oaks are a wonderful tree, produce heavy mast for wildlife, turkeys and deer and squirrels, but also have many hundreds of insect species and lichens and fungi that are dependent upon white oak specifically. So each white oak that you have in a place brings in many, many hundreds of species, which each in turn bring in their own set of species that interact and are dependent upon them. White oaks thrive both as mature trees as well as seedlings with intermittent fire events. And we're interested in having prescribed fires out in this section of woods as the main type of disturbance event, because we believe that's what this given area of the farm calls for. We think that burning off a lot of the leaf litter and other thick debris on the forest floor will help set conditions for more life to grow, and also help keep down competition of fire intolerant species. Like there's loads of red maple in these woods which cannot tolerate fire, and which are so dense in some places that they might actually outcompete the white oaks that are coming up. What is interesting about these woods is that there's a similar effect to the pine stand that I showed, where there's such thick, heavy mulch in the leaves and forest duff and tree litter that there's almost no understory in these woods, which this time of year, most of southern Appalachia, when you walk around the woods, there's an immense amount of shrub layer and herbaceous layer plants coming up. We're not really interested in running pigs up here or setting up any infrastructure to do so because, well, it's not incredibly steep. It is sloped enough in this section of the woods that we're just not really interested in disturbing the ground to that extent where heavy rain events could lead to significant runoff and erosion around the trees and down into the streams and other parts of the farm. And while we feel okay about the soil being exposed temporarily as part of kickstarting succession down in the riparian woods, it just doesn't fit the context of what we're aiming for on these ridgeline woods. And it'll be really interesting to observe the changes in these ecosystems over time with different types of disturbance, being animal impact and prescribed burns, and just learn from that, learn from observing. You know, there's so many books and other places that you can visit and learn from about this stuff, but being here and getting to see the changes every day is something that really excites us. So that's just a little bit about some of the forest management. None of it's really concrete in the long term, and we have a number of friends who are professionals in forestry and ecological forestry that we've been bringing out and are going to continue to bring out onto the farm to help us inform our management decisions, as well as to help with some of the technical parts like setting some of these woods on fire. So thanks for watching. Please comment any questions or thoughts that you might have about this video, and make sure to like the video if you like the video and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.